Namaste, my name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Centre, London. Now, some may think of Nehru Centre as just this beautiful fine building, and it is a fine building, no doubt. We have a wonderful art gallery out here. We have an awesome auditorium on the first floor with a capacity of 100 to 120 people right here in the heart of central London in Mayfair. But the Nehru Centre is a lot more than this fine building. The Nehru Centre is also an online platform. We are available on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram and on YouTube. And so the Nehru Centre is actually wherever you want it to be. Of course, we'd love for you to come to the physical events that we organize out here when we do organize them. But do join all our online platforms as well. This is a hybrid world. We are going to have offline physical events and online events as well. So do join our online platforms and do keep giving us feedback of what you think of it. We'd love to host you out there. We'd love to hear what you think of our events, and do keep sending in your suggestions as well. We do keep imbibing and learning from the feedback that you give to us to give you programs that you guys might enjoy. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Namaste. Jai Hind. Namaste, everyone. Pleasure having you back. Pleasure being, seeing a live audience at this rather empty and sad auditorium for the last 18 months. My name is Amish Tripathi. I'm the director of the Nehru Centre. Thank you so much for gracing our auditorium with your presence. We have had to restrict the audience. We've had to restrict the RSVPs. I'm sure you understand that. We do follow some of the protocols for COVID, but this wave, we've been told scientifically, is not as serious as the previous one was. Also, just a bit of hygiene news for you guys. This program is going to be, in fact, every program that we do in-person event is going to be broadcast live on all our social media platforms. So smile, you guys will be on TV. But this is a hybrid world now. So everything that's physical will actually go online as well and be broadcast everywhere. We are delighted that the first event that we are having in 18 months now is on a very important subject by a brilliant poet and thinker, Sudeep Sen, with his book, Anthropocene. I'm sure many of you know that geologists say that the age that we're living in, the geological age that we're living in, is called the Holocene. This is the age that began after the end of the last great ice age, which was around 12,000 years ago. And in geological terms, it's been an abnormally benign age. We haven't had massive climate change events in the last 12,000 years. And now geologists say that a force of nature has risen, which has disturbed the balance of climate to such a degree that massive climate change events are happening now. And therefore, they say that should we consider that the Holocene is ending and a new geological age is beginning, and they're calling it Anthropocene now. Anthropocene means the age of man. We are now a force of nature, largely a negative force of nature, sadly. But there is an approach that if we see ourselves as humanity, as ourselves as powerful enough to be able to impact nature negatively for now, it means that perhaps we can impact things positively as well. If we can learn to control ourselves, if we can learn to moderate ourselves. This is a very, very important debate. I think it's one of the critical debates of our times, and we couldn't have a better thinker than Sudeep to explore this because he has roots in India and an exposure to the UK. One certainly cannot deny that Europe, yes, created much of the climate change issues, but we certainly cannot deny that Europe is at the forefront of handling many of them. India is a country where the environment in our traditional way wasn't seen as a resource to be exploited, but as a goddess to be worshipped. India can be a part of the climate change, or rather the mitigation story as well. Would love to hear the views of of an important thinker like Sudeep on this very critical subject. We're delighted to host this book launch. And without any further ado, I'm going to call Mr. Guptara, his publisher, to come up and guide the proceedings. Thank you so much once again for joining us. We are delighted to be hosting a physical event once again. Give a round of applause to yourselves for braving COVID and coming here. Thank you.
My thanks as well to Mr. Tripathi, Amish, for kindly hosting the event. This is not my first time in this hall either, in this auditorium either, except that I'm normally been here as a speaker. The last time I was here was, 10 years ago or something, and I was speaking on Swami Vivekananda and the rise of Indian philanthropy. And if you're interested, I think the lecture is still somewhere on the internet. But because I've normally been here as a speaker, and it's the first time I'm here as a publisher, special thanks to Amish Tripathi and the Nehru Center for kindly hosting the event. Now, the idea is that we'll begin with some films. Three poetry films are going to be shown to us first. And then, if you don't mind, I will introduce our chairman after that. So can we have the poetry films starting, please?
Om Tadam Shvam Shau Varaniyo Jyotish Kumbhasya Dhimahi Krutam Bhavyam Hi Bhavaya Om Gayatri Padme Hum, oh, the jewel in the lotus. 1. Manas Sarovar, Mount Kailash. Frayed, flapping in the high winds, prayer flags gently unravel. Homage to the day's first light. But today the dawn is not as bright, though heavy, brooding, silver grey like the lake's shimmering glass top. No one is here except for a woman staring far away, wrapped in her sanctity of continuous linen, her own sari like a prayer flag, though devoid of any colour. She isn't mourning or crying, just gazing fixedly into the water's changing glimmer as the sky's wet weight and the shore's rocky line meet, their edges meanderingly melting into the lake itself. I stood far behind her, behind everything she saw. She was only an accidental figure in the widescreen frame. Unlike her, I was looking skywards through the prayer flag's translucent cotton, counting each thread of each piece of cloth that wove private stories whispered only to me. Weather-worn, strung across canted multiple horizons, I tried to map their own geographies, each an island, each with its own terrain, texture, inscription, and scripture. Found on the highest points on land, as close to the sky as is possible, these magic carpets, shapes caught on an unintentional clothesline were more meaningful to me than this vast monastic scenery. How each flag, each one must have preserved secrets that only their owners knew. How each a talisman exuded safety and calm, shrouding away grief for the briefest while when one forgets everything, real, imagined, and just dreams. My own piece of cloth that I once tied onto this line wasn't visible to me now. But that did not matter. I found strength in this procession of private passion, in these flags' lack of starch or hierarchy. Their stories passed down by one flag to another, toggled hand in hand through time and age, just like my pet yellow butterfly who infused each flower in my garden with the gift of life without any show or fare. I like the transparent quiet here. I also like the wind's occasional sound, its severe current tearing through the flag's heart, picking out the perfect pitch and melody. A memory now, a still, framed, not revealing to the world what I had once seen. The panorama's generosity, its wild, stark untouchability, how each story stitched and preserved like the jewel in the lotus, its crystal fine edges caressed by petal's soft skin, until everything folds inward, like a fetus in a womb, a toppled, misplaced comma, my own implanted memory. And then they bloom, fanning outward, each flag, strand, story, each private grief and pleasure, chanting noiselessly in the mountain's silent winds. After a long concert and after dinner, I find myself unexpectedly with you in my room. In this new space, finding oneself is wonderful. I was here and not here at the same time. Later, I felt as if I had entered a story of an old familiar novel, a character I knew but had not met in flesh until now. You me and my winter's dream. Our mattress is the wide ocean, the crushed sheets, the waves. We sail together full-blown. But during your long absences as our ships are docked on different shores, sometimes the bed dreams. I imagine the wet breaking the anchor loose, defying gravity, current, and electricity, as photons propel and burn even the wild salted expanse into a monument, a desire, permanent like the ocean bed, its pulses uncontrollably rocking. The waters, the bodies, the dreams. Silence has its own subtle color. Between each breath pause, heat simmers latent saliva, tongue entwined lisp. Here and there, errant clouds wait, yearning for rain, desire melting even silence to words. Words' color bleed incarnadine as your lips whisper softly the secrets of your silence. Your fine chicken blouse, white, sheer, and almost transparent, cannot hide the quiet of your heartbeat on your wheat olive skin. The milk-white flower adorning your hair sheds a solitary petal, just one. In that petal, silence blooms color. White, transparent white, pure white silence.
the sea silent. You hear its silence in my studio. And because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. And because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. Because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf, you hear the sea. Because I consider the sea silent, you hear its silence in my studio. And because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves.
Thanks once again to each of us, to each of you, for making the effort to come here and to be present with us today at this excellent and wonderful occasion. The first time the hall is being used after all these months, as Mr. Tripathi was kindly saying. Now it's my very pleasant duty to introduce our chairman for this evening, Professor Susheila Nasta. You have some information on her in the sheets that you have, and between us we've agreed that we won't go through a long introduction for each of the speakers. So just very briefly, Susheila, I haven't seen you for probably 40 years, so it's great to see you again. Susheila is an extremely well-known literary critic, certainly in this field of South Asian literature, Black British literature, as well as Caribbean literature. And she is the founder, editor of Wasafiri, which is one of the most well-known magazines, literary magazines in its field, that is modern and contemporary literature. And her work has been recognized by the award of the Benson Medal of the Royal Society for Literature, as well as being decorated by the Queen for her services to literature. So may I request Susheila, Dr. Nasta, please to come up and share the evening for us. May I invite you please to...
Thank you very much, Prabhu. It's a real pleasure to see you after all this time. In fact, Prabhu was involved in the very early days of the founding of Wasafiri. In fact, I think you were president of the organization that lay behind its founding. And thank you for your welcome as well. And welcome to everybody. I realize that this event is being streamed all over the world. I don't know how far it's being streamed, but welcome to everyone here and everywhere. I also realize it's one of the first events, as we've just been told, that the Nehru Centre has hosted in London. And I think it's a very special pleasure, therefore, to be here tonight. It's a kind of symbolic moment, I think, for all of us to be together and to discuss and to be able to be here physically in person. I've got a lot of connections with the Nehru Centre going back, so that's also wonderful. Book launches, Wasafiri events. Most recently, I worked with the previous director, Srinivas Gotru, on a traveling exhibition on India and Britain entitled At the Heart of the Nation, looking at the contributions Indians had made to Britain pre-1950, really, primarily. And most of all, it's wonderful to share the stage with such a distinctive community of international poets and critics whom we're going to have on stage, and I'm going to welcome them up here in a moment. I've known Sudeep and his work for over 3 decades at least, and our paths have crossed many times, either in print or in literary festivals in India and here. He published, I hope I'm right in saying, some of his very first poems in Wasafiri in the late 1980s when he was resident in London, and also edited one of the very first issues with us on India, South Asia, and the diaspora, a special issue which drew together writers from all over the globe, including Anita Desai, Imtiaz Dhaka, Romesh Gunasekara, Vikram Seth, Don Moraes, to name only a few. And since then, he's published, as you know from your bio there, over 26 collections, prose books, translations, and you saw those films, which shows the diversity of his talents. We've heard a little bit about the new book, so I'm not going to say very much about it because I think all the panelists are going to talk about it, but it plays on a man-made catastrophe. The title is primarily, in my view, dystopic, a dystopic landscape rendered with much lyricism, but engendered by the ills humans have either brought upon themselves or in the global south to some extent had imposed on them. And whether the pandemic or climate change, both are intricately bound. And I think it was largely written, but you'll tell us more, Sudeep, during lockdown in Delhi, and has both the privacy of sketches by an artist, almost of a diary, it felt like at times, yet conveying the same public voice of conveying at the same time the public voice of the poet, attempting to engage the precariousness of his specific present. And as is typical of Sudeep, it reverberates with the voices of a wide community of world writers. So words from Amitav Ghosh to Samuel Beckett, from Charles Dickens to Adrian Rich, stretch their tongues across the pieces and reverberate, speaking to and across the silences of loss, embracing when there's no possibility of human touch or intimacy. So that's enough from me as critic. So I want you to listen now to this feast of writers, poets, critics who are going to talk about Sudeep's work. We're going to have a discussion at the end. Sudeep's going to read, and we aim to finish, as I've been told, by 7:45 because you're going to have drinks. And so please prepare any questions you have before 7:45 for the 10 minutes or so at the end of the formal discussion. And people online, please do the same. And after that, there'll be plenty of time to talk as we have drinks and buy lots of books. So please join me up here, George Szirtes, Alastair Niven, and John Agard. And Sudeep, of course, whom I forgot in the midst of that. But he is going to read, and I think you'll hear quite a bit of his work when he does. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce George Szirtes, an award-winning poet, memoirist, librettist, translator. He's published numerous poetry collections since 1979 and been the recipient of many distinguished awards and prizes. His latest book, Fresh Out of the Sky, his poetry book, was published in 2021. He's also written a wonderful memoir of his mother entitled The Photographer at 16, which won the James Tate Black Prize for Biography in 2020. And he's recently retired from the University of East Anglia. He's a famous translator, and he's kindly offered this evening to share his response from one poet to another on Sudeep's new book and his work. George.
Thank you. I've been given a rather daunting task of writing a critical, analytical, formal introduction to Sudeep's work, not necessarily just to this book, but to previous work as well. for all that, and because it's formal, I have actually written it, forgive me. But it's an interesting thing. I begin with a quotation from Sudeep himself, and then proceed from there. The quotation is, record everything in minute details, leave no unresolved business or debts. You remember in the very first film, he talked about counting every thread of the prayer flags. And I mean something like that kind of care for detail. That poem, which I've just quoted, is Preparing for a Perfect Death, one of the poems in the Contagion section of the new book Anthropocene. Right, the matter of recording, or to put it more accurately in terms of literature rather than accounting, the matter of registering lies at the heart, as far as I see it, of Sudeep Sen's poetry, and always has. The value of registering is that we are aware not just of a process, but of a temperament experiencing the process. It is a difference between a set of figures in data and a hand touching the objects referred to in the data. I sometimes think of Sudeep's poems, and this is a personal view, as a hand moving across a terrain. It is a potentially sensuous gesture that lends itself as much to the erotics of his Ero text in Fractals, his selected poems of 2016, where the body is, quote, buried in warm skin, and where the skin, quotes, breathes love through its pores. It is as if the surface of the world constituted a kind of skin. I also think, in connection with Sudeep's poems, generally of short lines floating across the page with plenty of space around them, the way a hand might float above any contour. One aspect of that floating is his minimal use of metaphor and simile, the very staple of most poems, a way of moving between two levels of attention while being aware of both. The floating is a form of close attention to one thing. It entails a kind of grace. And then I remember the prose poems that he also employs as a form of reportage, as much as registering. Poems where the structures of thought look to locate sensory data in some holding, joined up intellectual framework. The fact is that in his career, Sudeep has registered and recorded a very wide range of experiences in very many places. Hence, the description of him as an international poet. The floating hand has hovered over many, many parts of the world. I'm thinking here about the kind of poet he is. And my instinct is to think of him as a poet primarily of pleasure, a meditative pleasure, if you like, nevertheless, pleasure. However, Anthropocene, his latest book, the book we are celebrating and launching tonight, is not so much about pleasure, its themes being global warming, as you've heard, and the great COVID pandemic that, like global warming, has touched us all. These are weighty, urgent themes. And indeed, the book begins with a prologue, a warning in the form of a prose poem citing Frida Kahlo to the effect that the role of the artist is not to look away. Sudeep's quotations, and as mentioned already, he is a prolific employer of quotations as epigraphs, establish a bond of fellowship with both his contemporaries and the past. The point here is that the things that offered pleasure now offer suffering and danger. The book is divided into 9 sections, of which 3 deal specifically with climate change and 4 with COVID, leaving a prologue, which I've mentioned already, and an epilogue. There are 2 disasters, in other words. The first partly observed and partly in prospect. The second fully informed by direct personal experience. Both present us with suffering, fears, and apprehension. The subject of COVID, the sickness in itself, as well as the lockdown, deprivations, and political maneuverings it has involved, has been, and is likely to continue to be the subject of books and poems. I myself have one section of a new book, the one mentioned, devoted to it, and have contributed to various anthologies that focus on it as a theme. Just this last Sunday, I was at the virtual launch of a new collection arising out of time spent by invitation as a commission in a particular hospital by one particular writer. The poems were extraordinary acts of witness and empathy. And there's a whole school of poetry, of course, usually referred to as eco-poetry, whose whole endeavor is to draw our attention to our environment. Not that you would need to declare yourself an eco-poet as such to be concerned about such a subject. Is it not the case that whatever occupies our minds and senses seeks expression in poetry? Is that not what poetry is for? Prose too, of course, but since the business of lyric poetry is to engage with a state of things rather than with the consequences of actions, poets will find such states soaking into their very beings. Whether plagues or pending natural disasters are the theme, the effect is the same. The condition enters the nerves and finds form in language. Sudeep himself will, I'm sure, dip into both aspects of the book. He responds to both crises in his own way, the ways I have outlined. In a climate change poem, Heat, Sand, he writes, "Heat outside is like filigreed sand on my skin, swift, sharp, pointed, deceptive, furnace hot." Fever Pitch, a sequence of prose poems about the symptoms of COVID, begins, "The seductiveness of a slim, tall, transparent glass tube, the curved silver juices it contains, is such that it makes me forget the news of the birth of a new child. Human life and inert chemical life compete in an insidious way, the same way fact and fiction do, as desire and disgust, illness and passion." So here's the hand, here's the skin, the registering, the thought, and the return to desire and passion as coupled in this case with disgust and illness. If asked to characterize Sudeep Sen's work in a single word, I think I might choose the word grace. Grace even in darker moods. This is the world you enter when you enter Anthropocene. And now, or in due course, you will hear the voice too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, George. Is that on? Yes. Thank you. Our next speaker is Alastair Niven, who's sitting here on my right. And as you can see from your bios, Alastair was Principal of Cumberland Lodge, Windsor, from 2001 to 2013. I knew him best when he worked at the Arts Council and the British Council as director of both. He's currently a Fellow of Harris Manchester College at Oxford, And he's published lots of critical books on D.H. Lawrence, Mukraj Anand, Raja Rao, and as well as recently a wonderful autobiography in Glad or Sorry Hours. And Alastair is going to give you some comments on Sudeep as well. Like me, he's an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and was awarded the Benson Medal in 2021. So he's a fellow Benson medalist. Thank you, Alastair.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's really lovely to be back at the Nehru Centre. I know it's 2.5 years since it was last live, but for me, it's been longer than that. But I've celebrated so many wonderful writers here, great writers like Niraj Chowdhury and Mukraj Anand, and writers who are on their way up and who are going to become great writers. It's a very important cultural centre, and it's wonderful to see it coming back into real life and flourishing under its present director. George just now referred to the Fellowship of Poets and how in this remarkable book, Sudeep actually invokes other important poets. I want to think of fellowship in a more personal way tonight because, of course, the people on the platform have all worked together in different ways over many years. My friendship with Sudeep and my professional association with him too goes back more than 30 years, just as Susheila's does. And I feel tonight is a sort of celebration of friendship and alliance and collegiality and so on, as much as it is of a particular book. Before I say anything about Sudeep's work itself, I want to acknowledge the physical presence of this beautifully produced book. It's been remarkably well printed and designed, and one can't always say that of modern books of poetry. Sometimes they're quite sloppily edited and physically not well put together. But in this particular case, it is a nice work in itself to handle, to turn the pages and to keep on one's shelves. So I'm absolutely delighted by that and want to congratulate Prabhu, who has founded this publishing series in memory of his wife, Pippa Ran, Philippa Guptara, whom I knew well and regard as one of the most beautiful people in every sense that I've ever known. And to memorialize her with such a distinguished undertaking as this new publishing house is just terrific. Prabhu was, we go back even longer than Sudeep and I go back, because he was my postgraduate student when I was a young lecturer teaching at Stirling University in Scotland, and Prabhu was a young postgraduate. And I think I'm right, Prabhu, and yet you still owe me another piece of work, which you haven't. I'm awaiting it with expectation. But what a lovely book, and what a lovely tribute to your late wife. The book itself is a terrific undertaking. Sudeep has managed to gather some of the most impressive and one might almost say grandiose themes that preoccupy us in the world today, themes of ecology, climate, mass pandemic, so many things that I find young people particularly are concerned about. I think anyone who talks to a person in their early 20s will find that they're almost obsessed by the way the planet is going or where it's going wrong. And to have some of these themes gathered in such a sympathetic way as Sudeep has done in these poems is truly remarkable. In her introduction or her foreword to the book, Caroline Forche quotes a poet from Poland who won the Nobel Prize in 1996, Wisława Szymborska. I'll come to the quote in a moment. I just want to pause on the fact that when she won the Nobel Prize, almost no one in this country had heard of her. But I was one of the few exceptions. And the reason I was an exception was because I was then working at the Arts Council, and the Arts Council had funded a translated edition of Szymborska's work produced by a remarkably enterprising publisher called Brenda Walker under the title Forest Books. And we discovered when the press were looking, as they instantly do when a name is announced, for the work of this unknown to them poet, that there were piles and piles of unsold copies of this book of poems in Brenda Walker's garage. And they were released and they sold out very quickly. And it seemed to me a wonderful sort of story of how poetry can be very important, but it can nestle in little corners and be discovered in years to come and then make a huge impact. It doesn't always happen, of course, that it does make an impact, but it's there, it's been published, it's been created. Now, Sudeep, of course, has a reputation both in India and here and in other parts of the world. I'm not likening him to the Szymborska of that moment, totally unknown name to much of the world outside Poland. But the publication of this book is, I think, going to raise him to a new level of recognition, because it does, as I say, cover so many themes which are of paramount importance to audiences today, to readerships, and especially to young ones. I found every poem rewarding. I'm going to just comment on one called Disembodied 3, Within, in which it finishes up with these lines: I examine minutely the striated strands of the pirouetting feather now fallen, its heart still beating, its blood still pumping, its white untarnished. Life's dance continues, with or without us. Only in the understanding of what is there freedom from what is. I think they're beautiful lines. You have to, as so often with good poetry, pause and unpick them. And so I'm not going to do a lit crit exercise on them now. But if you go to lines like that, and there are many of them in the poems of this book, you will find that it's worth unpicking, and there will be phrases there that will resonate with you. Life's dance continues, with or without us. That we can get. Only in the understanding of what is there freedom from what is. I think that's magnificently put. Now, Szymborska, in the line quoted in the foreword by Caroline Forchet, said, history counts its skeletons in round numbers. Needs unpicking. History deals with big generalizations, large figures. 100,000 did this, 6 million did that. But of course, what these poems are doing, and what Sudeep sets out to do, is to make the round numbers individual numbers, lots of ones adding up to 100,000 or 6 million. And I like that so much, because each poem is in the end a recognition of the individuality of every person, and his love, or as George put it, his grace about humanity shines forth in every poem on every page. So I really do commend it very strongly. It's a terrific book, and it's very nice to be associated with its launch tonight. So thank you very much, Sudeep.
Thank you, Alastair, for that. That was wonderful. Alastair's followed by John Agard, who's a very well-known and award-winning African Guyanese British poet, playwright, children's writer. He's been taught on GCSE and A-level. Half the nation know his work, I would say. I've known him for many years through Wasafiri and through events like this, and he's published several collections of poetry, many books, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, including Playing the Ghost of Maimonides in 2016, The Coming of the Little Green Man in 2018, And a new book, Border Zone, is forthcoming, I think, in 2022. He received the Queen's Gold Medal for poetry in 2012, and in 2021 became the first poet to win Book Trust's Lifetime Achievement Award. And I happen to know John's partner, Grace Nichols, whom I also want to celebrate because she's also received the Queen's Award. So I think we should give her, I don't know about how many married couples, but she's. So John.
Thank you, Susheila, for that warm introduction. I promise I wouldn't be reading from all these books tonight. Let me begin with a confession. When Sudeep kindly signed a copy of his book for Grace and myself, and I saw the title Anthropomocene, I must admit I had never seen the word, and I thought, is Sudeep on the payroll of the Oxford Dictionary? Does Sudeep by any chance get a 1% commission every time somebody looks up or Googles the word Anthropocene? But life has a way of revolving around synchronicities. 2 days later, in a charity shop, £3.50, publisher's price, £20, I come across the book, Adventures in the Anthropocene, by the aptly named Gaia Vince. And I discover that the Nobel laureate, Dutch chemist Paul Crutzen, came up with the expression in an article in 2002 to describe the biophysical changes the planet is currently experiencing. Sudeep, in a note, goes on to mention that the word Anthropocene is used as a noun and a verb. I decided I will take mischievous poetic liberty. Why not a verb? And I promise you, the reader will be anthropocened by this work. But let me take you back for a moment to 1655, the year of the Great Plague in England. Again, as synchronicity would have it, a case of seek not and you shall find. I came across, I've got the receipt, I'm saving for my accountant, £2, original price $7.99. Daniel Defoe of Robinson Crusoe fame entitles his book A Journal of the Plague Year. He observes London and says this: the throng was so great, and the coaches, horses, wagons, and carts were so many, driving and dragging the people away, that it looked as if all the city was running away. Earlier, he speaks of the altered face of London. That description of wagons and carriages fleeing London, fleeing a mysterious epidemic, calls to mind those disturbing breaking news images of people fleeing Delhi and Mumbai, heading for remote villages. We ask ourselves, is this history repeating itself? Are we witnessing a momentous evolutionary moment within the geological calendar of time? And in this evolutionary context, I think of Sudeep as Homo Anthropocenes. Eat your heart out, Homo sapiens. Eat your heart out, Homo habilis. And don't forget Homo ludens, because the gift of play is miraculous. The fool is wise, as the Middle Eastern trickster Mullah or Hoja Nasruddin will remind you, as the Zen monks of crazy wisdom will remind you, as the simpleton of the fairy tale will remind you. So I want you to think of Sudeep as Homo let me get it right, Pocinus, reporting from the front line of a momentous evolutionary moment. Hence, the form of the book perfectly suits the thrust of his inspiration. We have haikus. We have a collage of quotes from a diversity of sources, snippets of news items, cinematically multi-layered, because a Homo Anthropocenus is in a position where things are happening faster than you can register. So there is Sudeep, ears open for a snippet of conversation, eyes open to the ever-changing Delhi skyscape. And Grace and myself had the pleasure of sharing a couple of nights when we were invited through the British Council to be judges in the Delhi poetry competition on this beautifully designed terrace that Sudeep, drawing on his knowledge of architecture. I'm standing there with Grace, Sudeep, Pretty, his son Arya, and we're looking at a neem tree. You will see neem oil in Holland and Barrett. For those of you who, like that sort of thing. But no, let us dwell upon that neem tree, because a single visual metaphor can encapsulate an epoch. Coming from the Caribbean, I'd never seen a neem tree. Apparently, it's an all cure. Anything from colds to hay fever to impotence. So I'm being told. If you go to Goa, they have a similar thing. I think it's called a femi. It's a coconut type of liqueur. I did take the precaution of returning with 2 duty-free bottles. You don't take chances with these things. And at that time, I think his dad was alive. But we're looking at that neem tree. So when Sudeep, in evoking a city strangled by pollution, ends with these lines, having begun the poem called Pollution, and speaking of the physically serrated leaves of the neem tree, and saying, neem once acted as a filter for us, now needs one herself. My mind flashed to Wilson's Harris, the Guyana visionary, marvelous metaphor when he speaks of the rainforest as the lungs of the planet, imagining those lungs themselves needing intensive care and needing an oxygen mask. It's a frightening thought, the rainforest in intensive care. Well, that is the image evoked by that neem tree, which the villagers call a pharmacy. And holding that positive thought of that solitary neem tree outside that terrace, there is this positive moment when there is this question posed in one of those fleeting haiku-like moments of air dropping on current times. Will we find a more compassionate world after this pandemic's debt? Poet as architect, as Thomas Hardy was poet as architect, explorer of the heart, couched in poetic form, extended to a beautifully designed book, lovingly produced by Prabhu Guptara, who I had not seen for maybe nearly 40 years, but a testimony to his inspiring wife, and from what you've heard, Alastair said, a beautiful person, Pippa Rand. And it's interesting that both Alastair and George spoke of the community and the fellowship of poets. Let us take it within that context. And I'd like to speak of the comradeship of breath. When I met George tonight, he said, "How are things, John? Long time no see." I said, "Still breathing." And listening to myself speak as I had a roll-up outside the Neuro Center. I do like my organic tobacco. I wouldn't sacrifice that. We all realize within these modern times, lines as pregnant as I can't breathe, which I don't need to spell out. You know what I mean. In this asphyxiated climate, let us, when we greet each other, value the preciousness, the comradeship of breath that we share, and let us celebrate Pippa Rand's venture into the world of the Homo Anthropocenus. Thank you very much.
I like the idea of the rainforest in intensive care. That was a very powerful image, which we'll pick up later. So now I think Sudeep's going to actually read. We've heard little bits from the book, but I think you're going to read it in your own voice, which will be followed by a discussion.
What can I say? My God, what a performance. John, it's your evening tonight, clearly. But, you know, it's a real treat. And I'm speaking from my heart, which I tend to do. my head is all in the book. All the work, the research has been done. It's time for fellowship, comradeship, heart, and literature, and music, and poetry. And these are people who I've admired for a long, long time. And to have them in my, what can I say, the tossing galleon, as Milton would say, or Coleridge might hint to, we've carried this journey together 30, 40 years is a remarkable thing, because friendship in days of social media is only one click away or a right swipe out or in. So thank you all, friends, scholars, remarkable people, really. Thank you, Amish, another fine writer. And most of all, thank you, Prabhu Guptara, who's just done an incredible job. He put together an incredible. I've been here for 3.5 months, and I've not been on a literary book tour the way I've done it this time. Thanks to Prabhu, my new friend John Oakes, who's sitting next to him, who looks after publicity, who looks after lots of important aspects of Piperan, his neighbor in Cambridge, from St. Catherine's, a reading which I will do on my return next time. But let me just read a few poems so that you can get a sense of what the book is like. This one is called Disembodied, and this was written in the early days of the pandemic in Delhi, and also the backdrop is the huge polluted air that Delhi has, and being an asthmatic, it's an impossible space to be in. And in fact, after many years, I spent the winter in England. I haven't taken my Ventolin inhalers or any medication, and I've been really healthy here. So, you know, if we can get our act together, we can do a lot in a very short time. Disembodied. My body carved from abandoned bricks of a ruined temple, from minaret shards of an old mosque, from slate remnants of a medieval church apse, from soil tilled by my ancestors. My bones don't fit together correctly as they should. The searing ultraviolet light from aurora borealis patches and edge corrects my orientation. Magnetic pulses prove potent. My flesh sculpted from the fruits of the tropics, blood from coconut water, skin colored by brown bark of Indian teak. My lungs fueled by Delhi's insidious toxic air, echo asthmatic sounds, a new vinyl dub remix. Our universe where radiation germinates from human follies, where contamination persists from mistrust, where pleasures of sex are merely a sport, where everything is ambition, everything is desire, everything is nothing, nothing and everything. White light everywhere, but no one can recognize its hue. No one knows that there is color in it, all possible colors. Body worshipped not for its blessings, but its contours. Artificial shape shaped by Nautilus, skin moistened by L'Oreal and not by season's first rains, skeleton strengths not shaped by earthquakes or slow molded by fearless forest fires. Ice caps are rapidly melting, too fast to arrest glacial slide. In the near future, there will be no water left, or too much water that is undrinkable, excess water that will drown us all. Disembodied floats afloat like Noah's Ark. No GPS, no Polestar navigation, no fossil fuel to burn away, just maps with empty grids and names of places that might exist. Already, There's too much traffic on the road. Unpeopled hollow metal shells without brakes swerve about, directionless, looking for an elusive compass. I'll read this poem out partly for two reasons. One, you saw the song version of the poem, that is, spelt I.E. And I've had the privilege of collaborating with dancers, musicians. I'm very, very active. I love being inspired by the cross arts, because I think if we live in a sort of silo space of only poetry or only fiction, only academia, it can be quite asphyxiating, not just because of the pandemic, but just otherwise. I, of course, grew up in a family which was, you know, there was argument all around. The argumentative Indian, as Amartya Sen wrote a whole thesis on it. There was food, there was wine, there was way too much food, and there was comradeship and a lot of poetry and a lot of singing. So this one is called That Is, and it's dedicated to my son Arya, who's here. And I sent the poem to him, and he said, "Oh, Baba, not one more poem from you." But he responded by saying something like, "You know, it's beautiful. I have no idea what you're talking about." But I was very, very happy that it at least aesthetically responded to that. And then you see another version of how an American songwriter, a musician, has responded to the same poem in a sung version, a person who I haven't actually met yet. That is because you hear the sound of a lone rustling leaf. You hear the sea. That is because I consider the sea silent. You hear its silence in my studio. That is, and because of that, the silence will not empty the sea of its leaves. I read two short poems. Both these have visual references, so when you see the book downstairs, you'll have a sort of point of reference. The first of the two images is a front page of the New York Times after the first pandemic, which was a blank front page. And the second one basically lists the people who died in the first pandemic. And it's a roster of names, not all the names, of course. Not only it's graphically and visually so arresting, but you know, how can you not respond both visually if you're an aesthete and politically if you're politically inclined? So this one is called Obituary, and I'll read both the short poems together because I'm a real fan of companion poets. Goes back to the tradition of, say, Milton, who wrote La Allegro and El Penseroso, for instance, as twin poems, and there's so many examples in English and world literature. This one's called Obituary, and the epigraph is simply the headline from New York Times, and I quote, "They were not simply names on a list. They were us. Death knell peals, numbers multiply, virus ravages us one by one. Newspaper columns loom, unsteady ghostly apparitions on broadsheets, name, age, date of death, tall epitaphs in fine print. Ink spills, bleeds dark, newsprint blotting out our wheezing breath. No amount of hygiene ritual enables our lungs to resuscitate. Our lives, micro-point-sized fonts on an ever-inflating pandemic list. Black specks, fugitive lonely numbers, the deceased on an official roster. Another sick, another dying. another dead. Yes, they were us. And this penultimate poem, which is part of the companion poem, is another photograph which I took, and it's rather dark, as it's supposed to be. And it was taken, at night, when you go to the loo, and it's cold and you don't want to go there, but you have to, and then you come back and you forget to shut the door behind you properly. And I saw this image with just the sliver of light coming from the back of the door, which resembled a crucifix. And a whole lot of things sort of, was going through my head. And of course, it was also the time of George Floyd and so on. So it just came together in that sort of way. This is called Hope Light Leaks. And it opens with an epigraph from Martin Luther King Jr. And I quote, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that." Late at night, light leaks, spilling beyond the door's rectangle edge. A cleaving schism, its shape a partial crucifix, a new resurrection. Light's plane waxes, wanes, viral load expands, contracts. Photons spill, conduction sparks. Light slow removes, cataracts veil. In this blackness, lives matter. And for the sake of time, I will skip and just read one more poem. And I'm choosing this one. This was not something that I was planning to read, but all of you talked so much about language and grace is sitting there. Grace was a word which was used, and Grace is John Agard's wife, and Grace is sitting right there. The only couple in the UK, I think, who won the Queen's Gold Medal for poetry, so they have it in their house, two of them. So I think it's all for all of us. Language, the way it's twisted and turned, it's misused, cancel culture, social media wranglings, and so on. It can destroy people, it can energize people, but it's also an ode to my old first typewriter, which I bought, a secondhand typewriter, which still functions, which is in my desk in Delhi. The problem, of course, is to source the red and black silk ribbon is more expensive to get it going. But it's an ode to that, and it's so much more. And thank you so much for your patience. And it's what a treat to be here. Language. It opens with an epigraph from Italo Calvino, and I quote, "Without translation, I would be limited to the borders of my own country. The translator is my most important ally." My typewriter is multilingual, its keys mysteriously calibrating my bipolar, forked tongue. Black red silk ribbon spools unwind as the carriage moves right to left. In cursive hand, I write from left to right. My tongue was born promiscuous, speaking in many languages. My heart spoke another, my head yet another, the translation seamless. Oracles, ventricles pump blood. Corpuscle-like alphabets, phrases, syntax cross-fertilize my text, breathing life. Texture enriched, music, cadence spatially enhanced, osmotic, polyglottal, a polygamy of grammar. Letter forms dance, ligatures pirouette, ascenders, descenders, pitch perfect. Imagination isn't caged in speech. Speech cannot be caged in language. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really great to hear you. Well, I'm sure everybody here has lots of questions they would like to put to Sudeep and also the audience. I think we have about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes now for questions, both on the panel, in the audience and online. I'll kick off with the first one, which is really, I think this has come up through what everybody's been saying. You know, you have all these voices in your poet's head as you're writing this book, and I'm imagining you're sitting in your house in Delhi, and they're accompanying you, all those people, those voices that you're listening to. And you've just read the poem about the typewriter, which again has, and you mentioned the idea about translation and taking you beyond boundaries. I just wondered how important that was to you in lockdown. I mean, every poet is isolated as they write, obviously, and that's just a normal thing for writers. But how was it in lockdown, being alone with those voices, and how, to what degree did it really drive this new book?
You know, it's a very, very odd thing to say because it doesn't sound right, politically speaking, but whenever I've been politically correct, never. You know, the book was a gift of the pandemic to me. I don't think I would have written it had I not been locked down for 2 years. You can't step out of the house, or interactions are very limited. More searingly difficult for me was not to visit London because my son lives here for 2.5 years. And, you know, 2.5 years is a long time not to see your child. But the voices and people, they are my friends. All the books around me in my study are my friends. I have books by all these people in the panel. They keep me warm, energized, mentally fertilized. And I'm anal, of course. You know, my bookshelves are alphabetically arranged because I have to find the books. They're genre arranged. But yes, the lockdown itself was, in a sense, gave you a kind of focus. But, you know, as writers, I lead a very, very solitary life. It wasn't any different for me at one level. The only problem was live events like this were not happening, which is not fun because, you know, when you're stuck in the room for, you know, 12 hours in a day, you want to just go out and meet some people and have a conversation. So that was difficult, and not traveling was difficult. But the fact that you're able to reflect upon very important issues in a way was very, very good in that space. It allowed me to look at things in a way that others wouldn't. So I have the privilege of having a terrace in my house, and I would go up every day in the morning, and within a month and a half, when the lockdown was imposed in Delhi, the birds returned, the sky became bluer. Things were becoming normal externally, whereas we as human beings were angsting more and more. So we actually have to sort of say that, listen, the neem tree carries on in front of my house. She dresses herself up every season. The birds come and do their things. It's we who go to psychiatrists and get angst because of the pressures we put on ourselves and the world, which is why Anthropocene exists. This new age wouldn't happen had it not been for the follies of our doing. So yes, and the other part of your question was, it is very, very important for me to stay in a world and in the comradeship of writers and poets and scholars, because for me, they are my blood corpuscles. I mean, here we are.